Good morning. Can people hear me?
Morning.
Yep, I hear you.
Sweet. I guess we'll give Nate and Vlad a couple of minutes. We should definitely have some Casper talks at the developers conference. Go ping. Says Vlad's online. All right, I'm spamming them. Okay, well, let's get rocking. Do either of you have updates you want to give? Oh, we have Rick too. Michael, Kent, you want to give any updates?
Mike, do you want to present the rewards function thing?
Sure, we can talk about that. I don't think we've quite come to any final decision, but we can definitely have a chat about it here.
Great.
So last week, Kent and I were talking about proof of stake stuff for our chain and talking about the different rules we'd like to have around bonding and unbonding, and that's sort of naturally distributed to different validators. So let's see. I'm just bringing up the chat that Kent and I were having. Do you have it handy on you there, Ken?
Yeah, I can. Let's Let me see. I can paste it into the chat. So does everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, that's at the bottom is basically the formula that we sort of concluded with. Maybe we also said that the word Amr is probably better substituted with something called like step parent. And essentially the idea is that, well, it starts out with all the transaction fees go to the person who sort of proposed the block, and from there it gets modified by subtracting off all the transaction fees off any step parent block, and from there there's like a discount on proposing a lot of blocks. We don't want sort of like a single person to be proposing all the blocks, or just having sort of a subset of validators colluding to propose blocks and ignoring other validators. And then finally, there's a transaction penalty for essentially ensuring that there are no empty blocks, or that blocks with few transactions are penalized. And yeah, that's mostly it.
So I think it's also worth mentioning here that when we were talking about rules around bonding, we were thinking of having a cap on the maximum amount that you can bond with. And so if that amount is relatively low, then odds are pretty much everyone will always bond with the maximum. And so then what you're looking at is a situation where, for the most part, validators all have the same weight, right? So you don't have, say, one validator that's a whale and is just able to propose blocks and always have themselves get chosen.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea with the step parents type thing was that when everyone is equally weighted, you have kind of like a proof of work style race, right? It's pretty much going to be more or less random which block gets chosen because of the way tie breaking works in Casper. So we wanted to have the losers of the race still get something, right? You want to increase sort of the average payoff for participating, even if you don't always have your block get chosen by the fork choice.
Yeah, and to add to that, the rewards get distributed on that block, but it doesn't add to the sort of staking pool, so to speak. So until you unbond, and that means that, as Mike just said, basically validators all have the same stake throughout.
And the other reason for doing that is since you don't actually get paid until you unbond, it sort of encourages unbonding to eventually happen. We were also thinking that there should probably be some forced unbonding after, either at some rate or after some amount of blocks, just to capture cases where a validator becomes inactive, right? You don't want to have them just like sitting there forever.
Yeah, so I mean, in some of the other disciplines, like round robin discipline or something like that, the validator is penalized if they're inactive.
Yeah, we could also make it a slashing condition.
Yeah, that seems much more reasonable. I think they need to keep playing if they're going to be participating.
So what do you imagine that looking like? Like every every nth block should always be by the same validator, or like if you average over the last n blocks, you should have at least one per validator, something like that, even if it's not.
No, because proposals they should be making, whether or not those proposals are accepted is a separate question.
So I think we discussed that idea back in November, but the issue with I guess penalizing inactive validators is that you never know whether you're sort of using that as an attack or it's truly that they're inactive. I think having a discount is more like, I guess it might have.
I mean, the penalty doesn't have to be a slashing condition. It can be a discount, but there needs to be something that forces them to stay engaged. There needs to be a pressure to remain engaged.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So maybe the discount is indeed a similar functionality.
Yeah, it's a pressure, right? If they're not at least making proposals, and again, I don't think we want to force proposers who don't always win the race to, right? You don't want to discount them just because they're losing the race frequently, because the tie-breaking condition is static; it's not dynamic.
Oh, so you're actually, I guess, incentivized to include blocks that you've lost the race in this model. Because I guess the other part that we haven't really mentioned is how this reward is weighted. And the idea is we're still trying for this heaviest subtree idea, where if you include a subparent, then the weight of that subparent is included into the total weight. So like previously, it was just simply the weight of the block is the sort of sum of the weight of the validators that have, or that point, or the sum of the weight of the validators that point to the parent is sort of what your weighting is. But now you have it such that you take it across all proposals. So essentially, you not only have the previous block of sort of what you're proposing as like the main block, but potentially up till n. If there's n validators, then you also have one, I guess, n-1 step parents to consider in your weight, and those could be included in the discounted faction. Yeah.
Well, have you run a simulation?
Yeah, so that's the exciting part that like Birch and I were discussing, or that we should definitely do that, basically.
You think you can have one by next week?
Probably. I think my sprint load this week is light enough that we can throw this on there. The one thing that I'm still kind of unclear on is, and I was trying to work out a little bit this morning, is exactly how that merging discipline will go. So if you establish sort of the main parent, and then you want to, when you also reference a secondary parent or a step parent of some kind, you want to somehow include parts of that parent's transactions that are orthogonal to yours.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like the join idea that I had.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so,
but the thing is, you have to limit that because people could just join.
Yeah. There definitely have to be rules around it. One of the thoughts I had was that you can only reference as step parents blocks which are childless in your view, because then it sort of limits them to being only the most recent blocks. Or we could generalize that and say, like, it has to, be no more than 5 blocks back from like the current number or something like that.
Yeah, right. N blocks back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems interesting.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
Yeah, I mean, picking the fringe. Go ahead, Ken.
I was gonna say that if probably just having the same grandparent is hopefully a sufficient condition. I guess it really depends on how fast of a block propagation time we're looking. And I think there was some research done, I forgot where I read this, but that it usually takes around 6 seconds for blocks to propagate. And that's sort of why Ethereum chose their block times. But yeah, I guess the idea is if we're searching for faster block creation times, then it really depends on, I guess, the connectivity of the nodes.
Yeah, and it's going to be more complicated by sharding.
Well, I think that, so I don't know if you read, Greg, the wiki page that I had made like a week and a bit ago. But I think a good definition of what a shard is would be an independently replicated blockchain, right? So, which is subtly different than what a namespace might be, because a namespace is just sort of abstractly a set of names.
Mm-hmm.
But in any case, if you define a shard to be an independently replicated blockchain, then basically this just plays out on every shard, right? If we say, you can't reference something that is more than n blocks back, that means that you can only reference more than n blocks back from the head of any chain that you can see, right?
Yeah, what I was talking about was in the case where we have namespaces.
But the idea is that you map namespaces onto shards, right? That's the whole point of what the sharding solution is, right? The sharding solution is how you map namespaces onto shards. Shards are, if you will, the actual manifestation of the parallelizing or splitting up of the work, and the namespaces is sort of the theoretical footing on which you want to do it, right? There, and you want to connect those two.
Right, but I guess what I'm saying is I don't feel that they're completely independent, right? Because you can have merges at the union of namespaces.
And you can have merges across shards too, right? That's the whole point of Vlad's merge block. and all the definitions around that.
So exactly, but so then they're not independently replicated.
They are, because a merge block is just a block that they both include, right? That block doesn't exist on some different chain. It's the same block existing in both chains.
Yeah, but there has to be something that is recognizing that that it is a merge block.
Yeah, so a merge block has a different structure from a regular block because it has multiple state trees in it, because you have to look at what the post state is for both chains that you're touching, not just
right. So that is the first evidence that they're not independent.
They're independent in the sense that if I am a validator in a particular shard, my hardware has a particular chain on it that represents that shard, and a validator on another shard has a different chain on it, but there's the potential that we share some blocks between us. So there are blocks that exist on my hardware and blocks that exist on their hardware, and those would be the merge blocks. And in terms of consensus, merge blocks still need to be adopted by both sets of validators, right? That's the other part of Vlad's definitions, is that if a merge block is safely included in one chain, then it has to be not safely excluded in the other, and all that kind of stuff, right? The consensus gets tied up, but I don't think that means that the chains themselves aren't independently replicated in terms of like hardware level and
well, I guess what I'm saying is that somewhere the merge blocks are recorded.
They're recorded in both chains is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but they have different structure, which represents the fact that you have multiple state trees, which represents the fact that there isn't the same kind of isolation. They're not independent. You have structure from another chain present in
certain blocks, but
exactly. But that's all I'm saying. In certain blocks, the chains are not independent. So they're not independently replicated. If they were, the meaning for me of independent replication is they're isolated. There's no information from the other in the one, and vice versa.
Okay,
but
that's not
what's happening in the merge blocks.
No, and that wasn't the definition that I was imagining. By independently replicated, I would mean like I could if I joined that shard, I would have to copy the blocks of that shard onto my hardware, whatever those blocks happen to be, and some of them might be merge blocks.
Okay, now I understand your understood. Cool.
But yeah, so the point that I was driving towards though is that namespaces, you have interaction between them at overlaps for sure, and you can capture that if they happen to cross shards using merge blocks. But you could also just have a shard that covers multiple namespaces, right? And
that's correct, exactly.
Yeah.
That's right.
And ideally, what you want is for your sharding discipline to be flexible enough that you can change what namespaces shards are covering to minimize the number of merge blocks that are required because of the huge consensus overhead on them.
Correct. Yes. That's it exactly. So then you can imagine that there's something that's a part of the protocol that's kind of shuffling this at regular intervals.
Well, so in the version that I had proposed in that wiki page article, I basically left it up to the validators to take care of that reshuffling, because if they're the ones whose hardware has to be dealing with all of the consensus overhead of merge blocks, and right, and they're sort of the ones that are in some sense in charge of providing the compute services. I think it makes sense for them to be allowed to have control over what that implementation looks like.
Yeah, but doesn't that create a security hole?
I don't think it, go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I don't know if what you're proposing is similar to what we discussed, I think, like a week ago. I can sort of paste this into. But I was under the assumption that we were staying with sort of this idea of, once a validator is kicked out or, is sort of motivated to unbond, they sort of, or they bond back to the top level or the root shard, and the root shard will then delegate them to one of the children shards, and so on. And this happens at each step. There is a probability that they'll sort of remain there, and otherwise they would just get randomly assigned to a further leaf down, and they'll end up at a leaf or one of the nodes, and then that would effectively force some sort of randomization of validators in a sort of hierarchical fashion.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. Greg, what I meant by having control over it is basically there is an operation that validators have available to them. Like they can basically say, I would like to modify the tree based on where I am in it. So it doesn't have to impact the how validators are distributed to begin with. But after you've ended up someplace in this tree, a validator should be able to say, okay, I'm having to deal with these merge blocks all the time. This is inefficient. We should rearrange in this way.
Okay, so that is that like a proposal? Is that part of the protocol for a self-modifying tree? Do other validators have to validate that?
Yes. Basically, the way you do it is via merge blocks again, and so that it brings in the validators of all the nodes that are affected by this, or all the shards that are affected by this.
I mean, I confess I have a great deal of sympathy for this idea, but I'm still worried that there are ways in which validators collude to, keep other validators with a heavy load of merge blocks.
Well, I think the best, the worst thing you could do is collude to give yourself a heavy load of merge blocks, and you just happen to have the hardware to handle that. And so you sort of effectively eliminate smaller players by doing so. But I think that's the worst thing that could happen. I've pasted a link to the page, and if you look at the creating/destroying shards section, that's what I'm talking about.
Awesome. That's great. I'll definitely dig into that. No, this is really good. I think this is one of the most interesting discussions we've had so far.
So
I'm kind of light on updates this week. I've been going through the partial trace definitions. I'm just worried that with the partial trace representation theorems are they go the wrong way. So I'm just trying to make sure that I understand whether or not it can capture the phenomena that I'm interested in capturing. Like if it turns out that every partial trace arises as a total trace, then something's a little off, right? Arises from a total trace, but maybe not. So I have to think it through carefully. Yeah. So that's the Oh, and essentially the goal that I'm trying to get to a document that I can hand over to the folks who have expressed a direct interest in um, helping to axiomatize distributed consensus. So that's what's driving the next document that I want to release, is getting the people who would like to participate in this. I also spent getting them up to speed so that they can understand the language and connect with us. I also spent a little bit of time kind of coming up to speed on the ZW calculus to see if I can figure out why Bob thinks it's easy to do a quantum just distributed consensus protocol. So hopefully more on that. It would be kind of interesting, right, if we can have a hardware realized distributed consensus, a quantum distributed consensus protocol. That's what Bob was suggesting is possible, given his understanding of the problem and what's available with these particular calculi, the ZX and ZW calculi.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Can't wait to hear more.
yeah. Well, I mean, you can. Here, I can paste some links. Here's the presentation. So there's a proof that ZW is complete for quantum computation. Yeah, here it is. A universal completion of the ZX calculus. Here's the link. There's the... And it's a fairly simple calculus. The thing fits on two, so it takes place inside a symmetric monoidal category. And let's see, where's him again? So here's the basic building blocks. I don't know if you can see those. So these are all the maps that you need. Some of them are obvious, like the identity or the, I think this is Hadamard, twist, cap and cup are all straightforward. These, what Bob calls spiders, are a little more interesting. And then the basic rewrite rules are given here. So that's the original ZX calculus, and I think here's the Z. Yeah, this is the ZX calculus. And then there's a ZW calculus, which is a, and notice that all these rewrite rules are bidirectional, so you can go in either order. I don't know, like say the COM rule and the pi calculus, which is not bidirectional. So these are equations rather than rewrite rules. Let me see if I can find the ZW calculus. Here we go. Okay, same set. We have spiders. Yeah, it's a little bit more complex. There's the twist map, identity map. It's a little bit more complex. And then these are the rewrite rules. And so now I'm kind of going through these to see what how we encode that, how we encode consensus. So there's a paper on let's see if I can find it. So ZW calculus distributed consensus. Shoot, let me try it this way. All right, I'll have to find the paper. I don't have it on me. There's a paper that shows that Prakash Panagadhan's original proposal for doing distributed consensus with a qubit style quantum computing needs to be revised a little bit. And I've lost track of that paper because I was busy taking a look at this one based on Bob's idea. But I'll talk about it more after I've got these documents in shape. Do we have any other updates we want to cover?
Well, I wouldn't mind if we have extra time talking more about the simulation that Kent and I are aiming to put together for next week, just to flesh out some more of those details.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because like I was saying, the merge discipline, to capture the idea of a join, Greg, like you had proposed previously, we think it's a good idea because it speeds up the consensus. Yeah. But I was struggling this morning when I was thinking about it to come up with something that seemed both reasonable and simple to implement.
Sure.
So I'm open to suggestions if people have any off the top of their head, or if we want to try to like work through that. So
what were your challenges?
So basically, right, the high level idea is that you want to do like a git merge type thing, but have sort of like a hierarchy of how you resolve conflicts, where your first parent wins over conflicts in parents below it, and then the second parent sort of wins over conflicts below it, and so on. So in principle, it should be a similar algorithm to how Git works. But I think the problem is that Git tracks more information than what we were tracking on the blockchain, right? Because Git actually knows everything about the post states, whereas we only track changes and don't actually have the whole post state on the blockchain. And so it's only locally that you have the real post state.
Right.
Yeah, I guess when we were discussing it on a Thursday or something, I was thinking that these merges don't actually do the type of joins that I think you're mentioning right now. I think mostly because if you have a non-conflicting block, I think the idea is you just want to push yours on, or like put yours on top of it, and that would just automatically signify that you want those transactions plus whatever you're proposing. And yeah, I don't know. I think it sounds like, if we want to go for really, or at least quickest possible block intervals, that it might be the case that we're only aiming to have a few transactions per block. And then I think it would be, I guess, more acceptable to, I guess, not really have this kind of merging thing going on. But
Actually, so what I've proposed for quite some time now is that it's not that you have a few transactions, but that you have high compression. So you have formulas which describe entire transaction chunks. So all the transactions that look like this, where they'll look like this, is they satisfy this formula, which is a structural formula. And then you get and then merging is also easy because you can express that as a disjunction. And so then you should get really high transaction speeds. The reason is because you have tiny block sizes that describe large chunks of transactions.
Well, you want to be careful with your disjunctions, though, right? Because you...
Yep. Yeah, you have to be super careful in this kind of thing. But think of it like, cron jobs or other kinds of, job languages where you have this predicate view of the jobs you want to run. So, all the ones that were issued between 9 and 5, go ahead and do those. Or all the ones that are issued in Seattle between 9 and 5. We know that there's no conflict amongst them, so just run them all. And then someone can join that with all the ones in I don't know, Vancouver between 5 and 9.
Yeah, so I think the cases where there are conflicts is what I was worried about. If we're just going to say that you can only join blocks that have no conflicts at all, then yeah, this becomes easy. And if it's the case that blocks are going to have sort of a narrow enough coverage that you can expect two blocks to appear simultaneously that cover totally different pieces of the state, then maybe that's a reasonable thing.
Yeah. So that was kind of my initial thought when I was thinking about the join proposals, that you can only join conflict free.
Okay, then maybe that's a rule that we'll include then. Yeah. So then in that case, merging is sort of trivial. That's pretty easy.
Yeah, but here's the trick is you still could delay the protocol because people will just keep merging, but not committing, so to speak.
Well, when you propose a block, because of the intense reward function, the few transactions penalty, right? You wouldn't propose an empty block that just merges two other blocks, right? That would actually reduce your reward. It would cost you money to do that.
Right, but what I'm saying is, like in a world where there are really, millions of transactions happening at any small interval time, you can just, maybe it's not the same in this world because joining and proposing are the same. You've collapsed the two, so you don't have the same delay to commit.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the idea behind what we're talking about with limiting until a few blocks down or just the grandparent, depending on how blocks propagate. I guess it's sort of what you just said about joining and proposing are merged, right? Yeah.
So I think that's probably a reasonable approach. If they're merged, then you don't have then join can't be a delaying function. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so if you do that and it's conflict free, then maybe we can do better later, but it becomes kind of it's easy to implement and simulate. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I think in general, as long as we're as long as we implement everything when we actually go to do it for our chain in a modular way, then yeah, it should be easy to upgrade the consensus protocol as sort of new research is done.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Oh, I like this. I like this a lot. I think we're making clear progress here.
So if we have a conflict, we do a split.
No, what we're talking about is when you can kind of merge, as opposed. It's at the other end of the lattice. So this is like when can you do when can you do joining of blocks? And so the thought is you do joining of blocks when they're conflict free, and if they're conflict, if there's conflict, then that's when you have to duke it out in terms of winning proposals.
Couldn't you just split at that point?
What do you mean by split, Jim? Create a fork?
Yeah, you split the shard into two shards.
Yeah, but they still have to agree. Otherwise, you have the possibility of double spend, right? So.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
Yeah. No worries.
So
cool.
I just wanted to go over what we were discussing earlier about, or I guess Greg, you mentioned that you were worried about I guess validators having too much control over, I guess, the hierarchy below them, so to speak. And I was wondering if, like, I can sort of see the concern, but I'm just hoping that, if we're having this randomization discipline on where validators end up, and we also have the situation where as you go up the chain, all the validators that were on the leaves are sort of also part of the nodes and all the way up to the root, then it becomes increasingly harder to change the hierarchy of something below you if you're higher up in the chain, so to speak. And so, yeah, I guess, or to put it differently, inevitably, if you are at the root and you control a majority of the root, then there's nothing that's going to stop you from changing the hierarchy below you anyways. So I guess I don't know. I thought it was a decent compromise there, or I guess I don't really see any other way to allow sort of the reorganization of hierarchy, so to speak.
Well, you could have it be a part of the protocol as opposed to part of a validator choice. So the protocol forces reorg once it learns something about network traffic or shard distribution and network traffic.
So we have a set algorithm beforehand that validators aren't allowed to change, you're saying?
Yeah, right. The valid, in other words, it's like a sub protocol of Casper that says, how validators how the tree is reorged.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, okay. Because in that case, it's effectively that when you want to reorg, you're bound by the rule in the root shard, so to speak, right?
Yeah,
because,
yeah, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm fine with that.
I'm just saying those are the two options, and then one is more. One is kind of draconian, right? It's part of the protocol, and the other is more, free, but I'm just worried that the free one gives too much wiggle room for security attacks. And so I'd like to understand whether or not that's the case. Like, so one clear security attack is that, a validator can manipulate its way into a particular tree configuration, and or a group of validators can manipulate their way into a particular tree configuration, and if they do, then what's the what are the if they're colluding, then I guess, yeah, it becomes possible to censor. It becomes possible to snarf up all the transaction fees.
So I guess the important part there is that the probability that you'll end up in, so let's say you're validating for some shard level A, and then so therefore you're allowed to control everything below A. But as long as the probability of you getting to A through this sort of randomized jumping from the root is always the same, then, if, I guess, it only hurts if you were planning to be in sort of a child of A. And I guess, I guess my point was, I think it's like the attack only, it's, I guess, mitigated is one word to put it, but
Okay.
I see the issue. It would still affect shards below A, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's right. And so there seems to me there are two issues that are working. Like, if the validator size of a particular shard is too small, so I'm worried about picking off the fringes. Right. That's been a concern of mine for a while. But then I'm also worried that if we, how do I say it? You can get control. You can manipulate a validator, or a cartel of validators can manipulate themselves so that they're sitting at I'm worried about a squeeze, right? So you get a cartel above and you get an attacker from below. Do you see what I'm talking about?
Not quite, sorry.
So you've got this cartel that's controlling everything from a particular height in the tree. And then you've got some attacker from below that's eating up the fringes, right? So that whole, from the fringe all the way up to that level, is now, completely compromised.
So the attacker is colluding with the cartel on the high area.
Exactly. And so now you've got this vice thing on a large chunk of the tree. And what we want is to make sure that the economics make it so that's still too expensive, basically.
Yeah, I see. I'll have to think about this. I think, I guess the simple way is to have a set algorithm, and we can sort of work from there.
It certainly is simpler. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Actually, I think that the other proposal is also pretty simple, right? I mean, it's simple to have a single operation that someone can submit and then everyone has to agree to. That seems very simple. I'm just worried about the security part.
So I think the from my view, the two proposals are actually the exact same, besides the fact that when I guess there's no such a thing as like a set algorithm, if that makes sense. Everything it's set by the root, right? Like if the root says we're going to hard fork onto a different algorithm, then that is sort of the new algorithm. And so it would be effectively the same thing as, someone proposes a new algorithm to the root, and then the root would either accept or reject that. And so the difference is whether, you're just doing that at the root level, or if every sort of part node down the hierarchy is allowed to do that in their own way.
I see this slightly different. But yeah, I guess maybe we can talk about it. We only got 2 minutes left, and but I see them slightly different. One is that the algorithm is that a validator can make a proposal to reorg the tree, sort of ambient calculus style, right? So in the ambient calculus, any process can say, I want to move into this namespace, right? Or move out of a namespace, or dissolve a namespace. Those are the basic operations. And so any process can reorg the tree, versus only the root can reorg the tree. And that's not the one is the root reorgs the tree on the basis of traffic analysis, and everybody knows exactly what that traffic analysis is because the code is open source. Right, those are both protocols, as opposed to someone proposes a new, like a mixed protocol, where sometimes the root can make reorgs, and sometimes, if there's enough stake behind it, a validator can make a reorg, or something like that. So there's a difference between algorithm and a single proposal, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But it's time to jump over to the other.
Yeah, we can talk later. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Ciao, guys. Thanks so much.
Yep. See you over there at the other meeting.